Greetings, this is the Grumpy Old Slan, and today we're going to be looking at the January 1925 issue of Weird Tales. This one features a relatively unremarkable cover, so let's go into it and see what the table of content has to offer us. We can see this issue features 20 stories and one poem. The first story is Invaders from Outside by J. Schlossel. This is one of those stories that span quite a few years and a lot of space, and it is about the conquest by some invaders from outside the solar system. And this apparently happened hundreds of thousands of years ago. There's a federation of 12 worlds. At some point, they will discover a planet going towards the solar system. This planet, of course, is inhabited by people who will attack this peaceful confederation, these 12 worlds that have coexisted in peace for so long. No one really remembers what war even is. However, they're pretty advanced technologically, and even though they suffer quite a few setbacks, they manage to fight off the invader, but at great cost, and manage to get back to the one planet that's not been too badly damaged to start civilization up again. Now, this solar system is ours. The planets are named, so we know that's them. There's also another world called Number 5, which is described as being between Mars and Jupiter. This is one of those places where I find the tale drops the ball a little bit by not coming up with a name for the planet. It's the kind of story we're going to see quite often in science fiction. There are no characters. The only names given are the names of places and of groups of people. So it's a very top-down view of the events. It suffers from trying to tell a rather vast story, but in a very impersonal way. Not everybody manages to pull it off and make it seem very suspenseful. You have to associate yourself with an idea or an ideal. This one's not bad. It does keep you reading, but I've seen a lot better things that came later and so had stories like this to build upon. The second story is The Electric Chair by George Waight. This is one of those psychological horror tales where one of the characters, as an experiment, is put in an impossible situation. Namely, he is strapped to an electric chair against his will. There's a switch near his right hand that will turn the electric chair on. There's a syringe near his left hand that he could use. It may be filled with merely distilled water, or it could contain a disease of some sort. A disease that could manifest quickly and make you die painfully, or one that could take years to manifest and take years to finish you off. Should this young man who's in this quandary decide not to make any choice, he will die anyway within a half hour due to some poison gas. The person running the experiment is an elderly doctor, and the young man's fiancée happens to be this doctor's niece, and he does not approve of the union. He's mixing the personal with the experimental. When the niece discovers what's happening, they go back in the room where the experiment is happening, and the doctor has reassured her that he thinks that the electric chair will work on him, but it actually won't. It's been disconnected from the switch. And he thinks that the poison gas will kill him, but it won't because it's also been deactivated. And the syringe only contains distilled water. They will all be surprised at what they discover when they enter the room where the young man was and the experiment was taking place. The motivation of the doctor, his dislike for the young man, is merely stated, it's not shown, which kind of weakens the story a little. But otherwise, it was a fairly enjoyable tale of its type. It's followed by As Obligated by Armstrong Livingston. This one is about the traditions in a village where the rather well-to-do Sir Geoffrey Combe is very strong on tradition, and many people in the village he lives in are too. As they mention in the story, for the last 3 generations of Coombs, the last 3 generations of Hodgkins have been taking care of the plumbing. The last 3 generations of Stubbs have always supplied the meat, and the Smiths have always supplied the groceries and so on. As this Geoffrey Coombe is taking his bath in his new bathroom, he notices there are no towels. As much as he dislikes doing it, he will ring the bell to call up one of the servants to bring him towels. It turns out the bell doesn't work. He will complain to the plumber, Hodgkins, about it. The bell doesn't work, but they can't figure out why. This goes on for months, and eventually, as he's taking another bath, Sir Geoffrey Coombe succumbs to some illness, and in desperation will attempt to ring the bell, hoping it will work and call help, which it does. While it takes him a few months to recover, he will find out that the plumber, Hodgkins, has passed away. And it turns out that he passed away at the very time that he was desperately ringing the bell, calling for help. It turns out Hodgkins is also very much in that tradition. My father served your father, my grandfather served your grandfather, and he's proud of his work, and it was eating away at him that the bell wasn't working. So presumably his ghost is what saved Mr. Coombe. And the story ends as he gets a letter from some sort of psychical society that he was in contact with, saying how they've been contacted from someone in the afterlife whose name may be Hodges or Hopkins or something like that. And they're talking about a bell, wondering if he could provide any information about this. It's followed by The Rajah's Gift by E. Hoffmann Price, which I have done a reading of and I will put a link of as usual. I quite like this tale. The writer is one of those mainstays of the era. He's written quite a few stories in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Not as well known as he should be. I hope you enjoy my reading as much as I enjoyed reading it. It's then followed by The Fireplace by Henry S. Whitehead. And this is one of those stories that really could have used some serious editing. It talks about how a hotel burnt down and 4 people died in it. Then it cuts to 10 years before, when a traveler stays in that hotel, in the room that these 4 people were in when the hotel burnt down. And he is contacted by a ghost. And it turns out this ghost was playing cards with these 4 people who eventually 10 years later would pass away. He tells his story about how he was murdered and his body was cremated in the fireplace, and he is asking the traveler, who happens to be a lawyer, to please bring his murderers to justice. The lawyer then promises the ghost to take care of things. With everyday business taking priority over things, he keeps delaying. And about a year later, when he is staying again in the hotel, he is given the same room. And the next morning, he's found dead, strangled. The first part of the story was entirely useless. This is a serious flaw in the editing process here. All it does is show that the 4 murderers eventually get their comeuppance, but it doesn't add anything to the actual story. Which was disappointing, because the second half, where the lawyer encounters the ghost, how he promises to bring the ghost's murderers to justice and then fails to do so in a year, and then the ghost taking his revenge on him. That was the interesting part of the tale, and it's well told. Next is White Man's Madness by Lenore E. Chaney. This one about an explorer somewhere in the Andes who gets separated from his partner, with whom he's not been getting along. Eventually he panics because of his lack of equipment. Looking for fuel for a fire, he will fall down a narrow ravine and wake up to find he's been rescued by some locals from a nearby village. He believes that the people around here still have some of the mythical gold that their ancestors had somehow managed to keep away from the Spaniards when they came. In order to try and get his hands on it, he will pretend to fall in love with a local girl, will even marry her, and all the while just trying to figure out where the gold is. However, because he is an outsider, the tribe will not let him know where they go for their religious ceremonies. He suspects that's where the gold is, and after quite some time he will figure it out, manage to sneak into the temple and find it filled with wondrous items of gold. As he's trying to pack as much as he can, he slowly succumbs to the white man's madness of the title. I quite like this tale, actually. It goes against the cliche that people have of Pulp Fiction being very negative towards non-European, non-American, dismissive of the others. And in this case, the main protagonist, who's American, is a thoroughly unpleasant character. The people he's trying to exploit are drawn in a quite sympathetic light. I will not reveal what the source of the madness is. It's worth reading the story to find out. It's followed by Red and Black by Irwin Matic. This is about a man who runs a gambling den. His nephew is temporarily staying with him while he is hiding from the law, having apparently killed someone. One of his customers will make a fuss, apparently having figured out how he has rigged his roulette wheel. The man will then find evidence that his nephew is actually planning to steal his money with this man. So he will devise a plan so that the man will kill the nephew, and then he will try to get rid of the man. However, things don't go exactly as planned, and when they're finally found, all of them will have come to the end that they deserve. This was quite fun at first, even though sometimes a little bit awkwardly written, but the ending was very disappointing and caused all my suspension of disbelief to just come crashing down. And it's followed by When We Killed Thompson by Strickland Gillilan. This is a short story about a young man, probably a teenager, when the story starts. He talks about his family and how they're quite poor and they would take on some boarders sometimes. It seems his family and him have killed this one boarder named Thompson. We just go through his ruminations on the matter until in the end we find out what actually happened to Thompson. I really like this story. It's a great example of an unreliable narrator. I actually quite recommend this one. It's followed by Wings of Power, the first of a 3-part serial by Lady Anne Bonny. Briefly, the setup is a typical mad scientist. This one, like many, has an assistant, but unlike a lot of them, he has a family. He married a woman, has a stepdaughter. The woman passed away, and the stepdaughter is plagued with nightmares related to her mother's death. We also find out that his father was a famous scientist who had discovered an element that, like radium, emits radiation of some sort, but radiation that could be greatly beneficial to humans, could maybe cure cancer and have other great benefits. And we also find out that it can be used to hypnotize and control people. Now, his father had a fight with him and drove him out of the house, so he doesn't have access to all that information. He just knows it exists, and he's done his own research to try and find it. His father has a grandson, and the grandson is a doctor and is continuing the research of his grandfather. He's also quite the philanthropist, will help out patients, even though some people around him think he should be focusing on research. He just refuses to let people in need remain unhelped. And we find out what the plan of the mad scientist is. He's hypnotized his stepdaughter, and he plans to have her seduce this young doctor and get from him the secret of this element and the radiation it emits, which he calls a zeta ray. The situation is complicated by the assistant, who of course is smitten with the stepdaughter and who tries to use the device to hypnotize her for his own ends. How this will all work out, we'll find out in the next 2 installments. It's followed by Out of the Long Ago by Seabury Quinn. This is the story of an archaeologist who goes to Wales in order to do some excavations. He is soon confronted with local myths and beliefs about the area. People aren't happy about him digging up old burial sites, saying that only bad things will come of it. He is there with his assistant, who's a meek young fellow, very academic type, and a young woman who followed them there. The assistant is quite smitten with her. However, she seems to be more interested in the archaeologist himself. We slowly discover tales of what seems to be a werewolf and how it might be coming back from the dead. They see evidence of the werewolf, at first assuming it's just somebody who has some sort of deformity, eventually believing it. The fun part is the final confrontation where an unlikely hero will save the young girl and get his reward. I quite enjoyed this tale. Seabury Quinn was a very competent writer who knew how to keep up the suspense and describe things, but leaving enough to your imagination to really get into it. It's followed by On the Highway. This is another one of those stories where somebody dies and doesn't at first realize it. In this case, it's a young man who is finally getting access to the money he inherited now that his 18th birthday has come around. And for this birthday, his mom gave him a brand new sports car, which he is thrilled to try out. He races another car that he sees on the road. And of course, he starts to drive recklessly fast until he sees some pedestrians who are crossing what they call the highway, but I would assume isn't what we think of today as a highway. And he's basically faced with the choice of hitting them or swerving out of the way and likely crashing his car, and he's hoping he's going to survive. This being before the days of seat belts, he does not survive. And then he, of course, at one point will discover that it's his body there in the ditch on the side of the road. By now it feels like a bit of a run-of-the-mill story. We've had several of them before. It's followed by The Ocean Leech by Frank Belknap Long. It concerns the captain of a ship and some of his crew. They're confronted with the eponymous Leech, and it's some sort of sea creature that sends out pseudopods of some sort onto the deck of the ship and into some of its compartments. The people it grabs are not seen again. The way this differs from Lovecraft is that where Lovecraft would spend a lot of time establishing the scene and who these people are and where they're from and slowly hint at something strange and unnatural and otherworldly, Long just puts us straight into the action. The creatures here, we see the relationship of the captain and the boatswain. We see how he believes his men don't quite trust him because he's new to this post. They don't know him. As far as they're concerned, his mettle hasn't been tested. The story ends with them managing to fight off the Leech, their relationship having been changed because of the events. Quite a good tale, filled with action, but also introspection of the character and the character dynamic. We can see Frank Belknap Long starting to come into his own here, and I'm very happy to see that. It's followed by a brief poem called Two Crows by Francis Hard. It's very narrative and not too interesting, but also not outrageously bad. But after some of the stuff by Lovecraft, it falls a little flat, unfortunately. Next is The Fog by C. Franklin Miller, whose name unfortunately got misspelled in the masthead for the story. Bet you he wasn't too happy about that. And the narrator of this story is friends with an explorer type who's always off on one part of the world or another. As the stories start, he is going with a botanist somewhere in South America, hoping to find some antediluvian life, maybe dinosaurs, or, and this is where I think the story is quite clever, what dinosaurs might have become since those days when they lived. Since all this time going by, they must have changed somehow. The story then cuts to the narrator having had to go to Buenos Aires for some business, books a passage on a steamer heading to Panama, and he will run into this explorer friend of his who seems to be quite changed. He's very scared of something, and he talks about how they tried to fight this thing, and he theorizes that it would have been some primordial form of life, something that crawled out of the ocean. It's described as a grayish amoeba of some sort. It's killed the botanist off, clearly traumatized this explorer, and when the narrator doubts his word, he will say, well, where did I get this? And opens up a small box in his possession and shows in what he claims is a sample of this primordial life, and what the narrator assumes is just a lump of putty. The initial setup made me believe this would be one of those stories of explorers in a remote part of the world and what they encounter. And in the end, it was all off stage. So we didn't get to have that adventure tale. Instead, we've got the results of what they've discovered being told to the narrator. Next is Luisma's Return by Arthur J. Burks, Estil Critchie. This is the third story by this writer set in Haiti. I've mentioned before that he sort of takes some true facts and mixes them in. It becomes quite wearisome the way he changes things. On top of that, it never seems to make for an interesting tale. It more seems to be there to bash a certain segment of history. And it's likely I will skip any future stories with this byline. And it's followed by A Changeling Soul by Victor Lauriston, another story whose main point we've seen before, namely two people's spirits or souls are switched around so that they inhabit the body of the other. The twist in this one is that the narrator is somebody who is crippled, he's got some deformity, and the other man is somebody who is rather handsome, but is quite a scoundrel, and he still manages to charm a lot of people, both men and especially women, including the woman the narrator is quite smitten with and who just turned down his advances, in large part because of his looks. The narrator doesn't realize what's happened until he finds out about his death in a gambling hall where he was accused of cheating, and he doesn't understand what that's about, and that's when he discovers he's taken over the body of this scoundrel. The story ends with the narrator thinking that he now will be able to be with the woman he loves since she seemed to have accepted a proposal. We've seen stories of people switching bodies before. This one was quite well told. Bit of a morality tale there too. Bad actions will lead to bad results. Good actions will lead to good coming into your life. It was quite enjoyable and well told. Following it is The Spectre Priestess of Wrightstone by Herman F. Wright. This one is about a young man who is the 47th Count of Wrightstone. His ancestors have not stayed in their ancestral castle for ages now. It's reputed to be haunted. However, his grandfather stayed there and was found the next day dead with his heart torn out of his chest. We find out there's a specter of a young woman holding a sacrificial knife that is often seen there. We find out that she will only be satisfied if she gets the hearts of two of the lords of the castle. The young man decides to stay there in spite of warnings he's been given, until, of course, the inevitable end comes. One of the unusual things about this story is how the ghost would be satisfied with two hearts. Usually when numbers are involved of a certain quantity, it's 3 of something that are needed to appease spirits. 2 is a number you don't usually encounter with things like that, unless it's a pair, and 2 hearts of the same line of lords doesn't pair up that way. I feel 3 might have been more justified, and the fact that it was 2, I thought, was a way to hint at the other way the spirit could have gotten the heart of the young man, namely by him falling for her, but that's not at all what happens. It was still a fun little story, a fairly standard ghost story. Next, we have part 2 of The Valley of Teehemen by Arthur Thatcher. In part 1, our heroes got lost during a storm while flying to the Caribbeans and land in an unknown valley peopled with apparently dinosaurs and other strange beasts. And there's a tribe there. They had been captured. They're helping a revolutionary movement to take over from the king and the priest in the hopes that they can find a way out. Of course, they will. The way out of the valley is through a cave. And this is where we see some padding going on. One of the protagonists, the woman, enters the cave. She's captured by someone. And there's a whole chapter about how she's being held captive until her companions rescue her. They're then accompanied by some of the tribespeople back to civilization, except for that padded chapter, which really feels tacked on at the end. It was a fairly standard adventure tale, nothing groundbreaking. Next is The Remorse of Professor Panebianco by Gray Laspina. The protagonist of this story is obsessed with his research to the point where he ignores his wife, who clearly loves him very much. And he is currently looking for a subject for his experiment, which is to capture the soul of a dying person as they die. At one point, his wife will volunteer for this since she can't get his attention any other way. He will kill her. Her soul will escape. However, in the kerfuffle and the excitement of everything, he fails to properly capture her. In some ways, it seems to be what he regrets more than having killed his wife. And of course, some people realize that he killed her and he'll be arrested for his deed. I really dislike this story. The character is dislikable. I don't mind dislikable characters, but if the story is entirely focused on them, please redeem them in some way. This was just quite disappointing. And the story is followed by Arhl-A of the Caves by C.M. Eddy Jr. It's another paleo fantasy by the author of Weapons of Stone, which I read in the last issue. This one about a woman who is kidnapped by a man who hopes to be with her. However, her partner, coming back from the hunt, will discover what happened and will track them down to the cave where this other man has taken his mate. And there he will find the body of this man with her dagger in it, but she's not there. And he will have to keep looking for her, which he starts doing until he hears her cry for help. And he saves her at the last moment from being attacked by a gorilla. And they then are reunited. And it's the happy ending for the couple. This was another fun one. I quite like these kinds of stories, and it's nice to see 2 tales in 2 consecutive issues. I'm looking forward to more stories by this writer. Next is The Festival by H.P. Lovecraft. And the festival in question is a Yuletide festival, which is older than Christmas or any other midwinter festival. It's mentioned at one point it might be older than humanity. The narrator says he's been called to this coastal town where this festival is taking place once every 100 years to keep the memory of it alive. He's horrified by what happens, will refuse to go on and throw himself in a river. And then when he wakes up, he's in a hospital, and people say he fell in the waters of the river and was found. He's delirious, and he has to forget these feverish dreams that he had. Yet he is himself convinced that what he saw is real. This is another Lovecraft tale that brings up the Necronomicon. This one also mentions the Miskatonic University and Arkham. Lovecraft here is slowly showing us his universe. This is another one of his better stories. Maybe not as well known as others, but certainly memorable. And it's followed by Phantoms by Lawrence R. Dorsey, which is about a man who, in a fit of anger, will kill his wife and will then be haunted by her ghost and maybe the ghosts of some others until, from his point of view, they've taken over his body and will force his hand to raise a gun against his own head. And when people find his body, they ignore the note he left behind. And the doctor mentions that clearly his brain snapped after he killed his wife and just was insane. This was the opposite of the Lovecraft story that precedes it. Not very memorable and a bit disappointing. And finally, we have the Eerie, where the editors will discuss some of what's happening with the magazine, but they will also talk about the feedback they have gotten from some of their readers. Part of the controversy that was happening at the time was how ghoulish stories could be. People said they wanted horror, but they didn't want disgust when reading their stories. Of course, where that line is drawn varies between people. We also find out what stories were the most popular in the November issue, which aren't necessarily the ones that I thought were the best. They also talk about what some people have been asking for, which include stories that combine science and horror. The example they give is The Brain in the Jar. Others, and here I will quote, others ask for more electrical stories. From what they say, they're really looking for science fantasy, or what we would today call science fiction, except those words didn't exist back then. It would take a few more years before Gernsback would come up with a name for science fiction. This has been the Grumpy Old Slan, looking at the January 1925 issue of Weird Tales, and I'll see you next time.